Howdy, partner. Let's check and make sure these levels are good. Hello? Howdy. What do Tony Stark, the war in Vietnam, and an irreparably mutilated prostitute all have in common? The answer is I'm about to talk to you about them for 30 minutes, that's what. It's not really a hot take to compare the downfall of the cape shit superhero genre to the downfall of Westerns. Back in like the 50s and 60s, the size of your protagonist's hat was almost in direct correlation to your film's fiscal return. So the doomsayers of the superhero genre seem to believe that the roadmap for the downfall of contemporary superhero films lies entirely in the rise and fall of Western movies, and I don't necessarily disagree with that sentiment. However, I think it's for different reasons than is currently being claimed. First things first, I think it's worth acknowledging that a lot of this video was directly inspired by a Wisecrack video on the film Logan that like permanently sun-bleached my teenage brain's understanding of like the modern Western in a way that absolutely influenced my opinion. Credit where credit is due, I'm gonna put a link in the description. Just know that that's basically preliminary viewing for understanding what I'm gonna be talking about in this video. But I just wanted to throw that out there to make sure that I didn't get attacked by H-Bomber guy with plagiarism allegations. Now that that's out of the way, I would like to give a brief timeline of America and specifically how the outlaw archetype in classic Western movies is viewed as an in-text stand-in for America as a sort of righteous outlaw. So, following World War II, America, for once rightfully, viewed ourselves as the good guys. We fought in a war that was so morally lopsided that we continue to use it as the benchmark for like American military excellence to this very day. Of course, with that being said, we did not get directly involved with halting the massive genocide that was occurring in Europe until we were directly provoked. Regardless of what good we did do in World War II, our role there largely was for the sake of securing our role as a global superpower, retaliation against the Axis powers for the aggression of Pearl Harbor, regardless of how actually consequential American presence was in turning the tide of World War II. We like to make sure that we are in the forefront of receiving credit for the toppling of Hitler and halting, perhaps too little too late, the massive historical genocide of the Holocaust. So, you take this public image of us as this heroic outsider in the early 20th century and compare it to the protagonist of the Western films in what film historians dub the golden age of Westerns. So most of these characters are the strong silent type, almost always outlaws or other forms of outsiders from like the Western commoners. Now typically within the context of these movies, these protagonists need to be provoked, but once given the motivation to respond, they're almost always a force of moral purity, typically fighting back against some kind of like unjust oppressive force or someone that is bullying those who needs defending. After World War II, our record as a country was as one of these righteous gunslingers, one of these quiet outlaws who stepped in to protect innocence from tyranny. Now, compare this to the superhero genre and their almost immediate meteoric rise following 9/11. After 9/11, we entered what was probably our most like widely publicly supported war since World War II due to the like immediate collective trauma of a nation healing from 9/11, the first time since Pearl Harbor that we had experienced attacks on our soil. The military might and resilience of America was something that we really deeply stressed.
We must stop the terror. Now watch this drive.
Even more so then than in the prior, 2 decades of overseas war that we had been involved in. The superhero genre reflected this, renewed sense of national identity in the face of the perceived foreign threat, and portrayed us as this righteous and scorned military power. Most of the early superhero movies borrowed from this kind of militaristic arms dealer aesthetic, namely Iron Man literally being an arms dealer, literally going overseas and disseminating his weapons to all the Saudis and shit, and then Batman in his massive tumbler tank. Not to mention how in The Dark Knight, how Batman fumbles with the morality of instituting a Patriot Act style surveillance state.
I've got to find this man, Lucius.
At what cost?
Which only further borrows from military dialogue that was occurring during the War on Terror. Now, in order to understand what will happen to our beloved superhero movies, we don't need to look at the diminishing box office return of their cowboy counterparts, but rather the larger cultural and societal scene that was painting the backdrop for the failing of that genre. Golden Age of the Western began to wane right as we were entering, and let's be perfectly honest here, the greatest military failure in our country's history. The Vietnam War was famously a massive and catastrophic loss for the US military, both in terms of our on-paper military losses, but also in terms of optics for the US military. We took a massive hit in public opinion, both domestically and globally. By engaging in Vietnam, we stuck our neck into a place that, speaking geopolitically, was none of our fucking beeswax. And because of that, we suffered catastrophic loss at a rate that we had not to this point. And naturally, with the flower power generation growing increasingly fed up with our country's violent, warmongering ways, the image of the lone gunslinger coming into town and applying this kind of outlaw justice was becoming less and less popular as the 60s bled into the 70s, bled into the Vietnam War. And even later optical US victories throughout the Cold War, like the Gulf War or the collapse of the Berlin Wall, they had not fully rehabilitated the image of the United States within the eyes of a lot of that generation. The spotlight started to fade on the cowboy in all these other kind of square films, right? These films that reinforced traditional roles, while the baby boomers started to flock towards much more experimental and provocative cinema. You had an influx of French New Wave movies that were catching the eye of a lot of boomer theatergoers, as well as the rise of a lot of auteur filmmakers that were pushing boundaries in terms of not only what was appropriate to show on screen, but the technical limitations of independent filmmaking. Those types of movies tended to portray much more nuanced situations with much more nuanced characters than something like a classic Golden Age Western was typically capable of. Obviously, there's exceptions. We've all seen and all loved Good, the Bad, the Ugly. Now, we see a matching political disillusionment right now with the Zoomers, as we saw with the flower power baby boomers following the Vietnam War. Bush's War on Terror has seen increasingly diminishing returns, and this has alienated a lot of my generation in a way that might turn us off from the rah-rah militarism that is frequently featured in these types of superhero movies. So it's like, I'm sitting here wondering if I'm going to be able to have a fruitful future, and then I see Falcon and the Winter Soldier having a brief subplot about like how inconvenient Middle East no-fly zones are for Falcon.
Heads up, you're about to fly into Libyan airspace. And I assume they have a problem with that. Yeah, a big problem. And
I'm thinking, like, is this the content that represents me? What the fuck were the Flag Smashers? Did you ever watch Falcon and the Winter Soldier? The enemy in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, sorry, this isn't even the script. I just think this show's so fucking offensively bad. The enemy of the show, the enemy in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, is a bunch of people who are upset because they had their land taken from them and their governments weren't doing anything about it. So they were taking military action. They just get put down like a bunch of dogs. S.H.I.E.L.D. just takes them into a car and shoots them. Disney pulls the card where they're like, maybe they had a point, but you can't go too far.
Either way, our message gets out to the world. It doesn't even matter if we die. The movement is strong enough to continue without us.
Military action is simply too far when trying to achieve a goal. It's like, you would fucking say that, Disney Corporation, you fucking scumbags. God, it's so aggravating. It's so aggravating that they're trying to sell us that shit now. It's so annoying. God. So yeah, shit like Falcon and the Winter Soldier is not going to go over well with the Zoomers, obviously. Like, we're too smart for that shit, guys. Fuck off. So, Unforgiven. How does this psychopolitical philosophy relate to what is probably by far Eastwood's most morally complex movie? The answer, my friends, is subtext. Consider the description of the protagonist of Unforgiven, William Money, and consider him as a foil for the subliminal stand-in for America in those classic Hollywood westerns. This man is battered, he's decrepit, he's old, but he's also considered far and wide for his status as a great hero of the American West.
My guess is you're calling yourself Mr. William Money.
You have me confused with someone else, mister.
But in reality, Money in the movie is a gunslinger that would lay random women and children to waste just as quickly as he would blast a villain. Most of those, like, so-called glory days that he is so revered for, he was pissed drunk the entire time.
Ned, you remember that drover I shot through the mouth and his teeth came out the back of his head? I think about him now and again. He didn't do anything to deserve to get shot. At least nothing I could remember when I sobered up.
His days as that glorious outlaw were not these beautiful moral tales of good and evil as they were portrayed. They were actually just a days of violence and bloodlust and whiskey, as he just indiscriminately killed whoever and whatever stood in his path. Because of his status as a former hero, Money gets called in to do a good act, quote unquote, if that even exists in the world of this movie, in exchange for a little bit of dough. He reluctantly accepts this challenge and saddles up with his partner from the good old days and a quite literally and figuratively short-sighted young man.
He's blind, Will.
I ain't blind, you asshole!
Who isn't quite yet disillusioned with the glory in righteous, honorable killing. In doing this, he faces a great loss in his partner, who is killed by the hands of a man. He uses great cruelty, pseudo-fascist tactics in the name of upholding a moral law and order within their small western town. Ultimately, in this vicious, violent, unforgiving, wink, world that Eastwood crafts, no man is able to achieve anything truly moral or heroic. Everything is constantly being muddied by some extraneous factor, and even something that we would potentially view as moral and upstanding is undercut. When his little sidekick, the kid, takes out one of the men responsible for mutilating the prostitute at the beginning of the movie, it's done in a fashion that is really not glorious. He blasts this man while he takes a shit on the toilet, and you can see the look of horror on the man's face as he begs for mercy. There's no winning for any of these guys, and the movie makes a really good point of driving that home. However, I'd like to point out a crucial difference between Clint Eastwood as Edward Money and another similar cultural takedown that currently exists in the zeitgeist that represents a similar disillusionment within the superhero genre. The boy's now iconically menacing character, Homelander, fills a similar subversive America stand-in role as Edward Money in Unforgiven does. However, Homelander is depicted far more viciously as a stand-in for America and like that breakdown of the American dream. He's this sniveling, egomaniacal, power-hungry child. He represents a much more cynical, satirical, realistic look at these American ideologies through the lens of the superhero genre, similarly to what money represents for Westerns. The crucial difference, in a way, lays with the storyteller. The writers of The Boys are very obviously cynical, loudmouthed lefty types like myself. In the case of The Boys, they are comfortable painting Homelander, painting America as an outright villain figure because, like, let's be honest, like, do we not fucking deserve it at this point? But with Eastwood, you're not as likely to get that cynical perspective because the man is a very outspoken conservative and has been for a lot of his career.
I'll start it, you finish it. Go ahead. Thank you.
So for someone like Eastwood, he's a lot more likely to be sympathetic to America's sins, even if it is a hair more unrealistic in its interpretation. This is why he imbues the character of Edward Money with this nuance, like this very human, honest frailty and weakness.
One of my favorite scenes in Unforgiven was to do the scene where Ned and I and my character, they're all up in the rocks, the three of us, the kid and Morgan Freeman's character, we're all up there, and we actually ambush this guy. Now here's the guys who are supposedly the lead in the picture, and they ambush this guy and then to give him the coup de grace or try to finish him off in this kind of gruesome way. And one of them can't stand the idea of it. He's lost his feeling for the, for blood, and William Money sort of has to do it as a it's like an animal that's suffering. You can't just leave him suffer. You shoot him, and it's kind of stated that would be more the way it was, rather than two guys out in the street, and the moon and the sun in the background, and the backlighting and the drawing and the film, and the hero always waited till the other guy drew first. That can't happen in real life. The hero can't wait till the other guy draws first.
He reads that way because Edward Money is the reconciliation of an identity through the eyes of a man who longs for, needs that reconciliation to occur. This is probably why the world in Unforgiven is also much less hopeful than the world of The Boys, because if you were someone that genuinely believed that America has always been a force for good, and then lived through the harsh realities of the Vietnam War and the failures surrounding it, the letdown for you would be much larger than it is for someone who is already cynical and disillusioned with the United States' role in geopolitics to begin with. Because Edward Money being America, if America to you was supposed to be the only truly good country, and then you found out that actually it's bad, that would leave you seriously asking yourself if there was any good anywhere to begin with. So, if all of this is true, if our heroes out on the range and in the sky both represent America within the context of the collective consciousness, where does that leave all of our superhuman friends? I'm going to read that again because that came out weird. Where does that leave all of our superhuman friends? That's difficult to say, because most of the truly great post-Western masterpieces didn't appear on the scene until at least a couple of decades after the classic Hollywood Western had already trotted into the sunset. It had been, I think, 2 full decades since the end of the Vietnam War. Yeah, almost 2 full decades since the end of the Vietnam War when Unforgiven showed up. And No Country for Old Men was another entire decade later. There's a chance that true post-superhero cinema won't start appearing on the scene for another couple of decades. However, we have certain contemporary examples like Logan or The Boys or Invincible, or even something more out there like Birdman, that represent these very cynical takedown viewpoints of the fledgling superhero genre. So this leaves us with the question, have we already gotten our superhero equivalent of Unforgiven? Or will that genre top itself? And within the context of cinema as representation of the collective consciousness, what will be our next cultural avatar? We've been the cowboys, we've been the superheroes. What will people choose to represent all of us next? And it's hard to truly say right now, but I, for one, am looking forward for the Minions reboot that takes place 30 years in the future, that represents our collective mourning and regret over the inhumane handling of the Gaza Strip. I think that's going to be a very beautiful reflection.
I think this one was a chance to just put my stamp on what I felt about it. In reality, like you say, it is a crock. It is a myth.
I think that's all I have to say about it. Would you like to say something?
I was just saying you had 1 minute left. That's all.
We've got 1 minute left. Make peace with your gods. It will probably be Minions next. It's like fucked up Minion movie about like Desert Storm or like police brutality. Fuck, are we Minions now?